Hey everyone, and welcome to Solomon's Cave. The book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible, and it details much of Israel's history as they were preparing to enter the land of Canaan. And since we usually start with the title, this one is a little bit more complicated. So let's start with the relatively predictable Hebrew title of Vayedaber. This is again the first word of the book, and it means, "and he spoke." But this title, if it was ever used widely, was abandoned after some time. Perhaps because the Hebrew title of Leviticus, Vayikra, means "and he called." Though they sound very different, it is very similar in meaning, so perhaps it was to avoid possible confusion that they instead decided to move to the fifth word, which is Bamidbar. Bamidbar means "in the wilderness" or "in the desert", which is a pretty good title, since all of Numbers, Israel is in the desert. And it isn't all that different from the first Hebrew title either, as it shares three of the same consonants. Then, as usual, we move to the ancient Greek translation, and the title there was arithmoi, which literally just means numbers. By the way, you might have guessed that this Greek title had something to do with numbers, since the word arithmetic is Greek. In any case, we could have just kept the Greek title, arithmoi, or something that sounds rather similar. But instead, we decided to follow the Latin Vulgate, where instead of transliterating the title, they decided to translate the title and give it the fancy Latin title of numeri, which we then turn into numbers in English. Now the structure of Numbers is quite the head-scratcher. Here I have tried to make some sense out of it by looking at the various topics discussed in each chapter. The first two chapters have long lists of people and numbers. Then chapters 3 and 4 deal with the priests and the Levites, not only numbering them, but also discussing the tasks they have while the Israelites make camp or are on the move. Chapters 5 and 6 discuss a variety of laws, and chapter 7 describes an event. Though keep in mind that I'm going to use a rather broad definition of the word event, as it will lump together everything that has to do with people doing something in the past. Chapter 8 deals with the Levites, or the priests again. Chapter 9 are some events. And then the first half of chapter 10 are more laws or instructions. Then the second half of chapter 10 starts a narrative that ends at the end of chapter 14. After that, chapter 15 briefly interrupts the narrative flow with some additional laws. Chapter 16 and 17 pick up the narrative again. Chapter 18 deals with the Levites and the priests again. Chapter 19 returns to the laws. And then chapter 20 through 22 are more narratives, and are then followed by 2 chapters of prophecy. Chapter 25 is a narrative. Chapter 26 another list of names and numbers, similar to chapter 1. 27 more narrative. And then 3 chapters of laws. Chapters 31 and 32 offer some more narratives. And then 3 chapters that I could have called laws as well, but instead I call them as geography. And finally chapter 36 and some more laws. Others may disagree with my description of some chapters, or they would like to chop up the chapters in smaller sections, or choose different categories altogether. But regardless of the system you use, Numbers will always be a complex web of genres and sections and seemingly arbitrary transitions. So what I'm going to do is divide up the book in 2 different ways. First, I will divide it up based on geography, and then one based on time. Let's start with the geography division. In the second half of Exodus and all of Leviticus, Israel is at Mount Sinai. And so they are for the first 9.5 chapters of Numbers. Then the Israelites travel north to Kadesh. These travels start halfway through chapter 10 and end in chapter 12. Then chapters 13 through 19 all occur at Kadesh. Then Israel is forced to wander around in the desert for 40 years. Not much text is devoted to the bulk of that time, other than the last year or so, when Israel tries to enter the land of Canaan, not directly from the south, but from the east. This detour is described in chapters 20 and 21, and the narrative continues in chapter 22. Then around chapters 22 or 23, Israel is getting pretty close to the land of Canaan, and is getting ready to enter it. Then there are a few narratives, as well as some legal and geographical issues that need to be resolved before they can finally enter the land. Okay, so that makes a bit more sense. Let's see if we can refine that even more if we look at a division based on time. And let's not look at a few days or months or even years, but let's look at generations. We see that in the first 14 chapters, the initial Exodus generation is central. Then after chapter 14, the 40 years of wandering begins, and you can slowly see the transition. The transition to the new generation is complete when there is a second census in chapter 26 that runs mostly parallel to the first census of chapter 1. And then the rest of the book is all about this new generation preparing itself to enter into the land of Canaan. So with these divisions in mind, let's look at some of the geographical highlights in the book of Numbers. Here you can see the Sinai Peninsula, with Mount Sinai at the bottom. From there, the Israelites walk north toward Kadesh. That is where they send out the spies to check out the land of Canaan. When the spies come back, and the people no longer trust God, they are forced to walk around for 40 years. Then, at the end of 40 years, they make a second attempt at entering the land. But this time, they won't enter from the south, but they will take what is called the King's Highway and enter the land from the east. But there is a problem, because they would have to travel through the land of Edom. When they refuse to allow them passage, God tells them to leave Edom alone and walk around them. So they do. But then they meet the next obstacle, and that is Moab. And they don't want them passing through their territory either. Then Israel is forced to move even further north. But on the road they are attacked twice. Once by Sihon, king of the Amorites, and once by Og, the king of Bashan. But thankfully Israel survives the attacks and is even able to claim most of their territory on the east bank of the Jordan. The king of Moab got a little restless, so he calls for Balaam to curse Israel for a large sum of money. But when Balaam finally arrives, he instead blesses Israel, so that plan didn't go so well. Now let's retell the story again, but now with a focus on the division between the two generations. And let's keep track of how well their faith is doing with this fancy faithometer. We start off with the Exodus generation. Yes, there were some hiccups on the road when they were getting to Mount Sinai, but now they are full of hope. However, as they are traveling to Kadesh, there are a few challenges that show that they are still not there where they should be with regards to how much they trust God to take care of them. Things become even more tense when the 12 spies return with some bad news. What's worse, after they show that they don't trust God, some are even stupid enough to try and conquer the land by themselves without God's help. This is a total failure, and the people's faith is in complete shambles. But then, during the 40 years of wandering, a new generation starts to replace the old, fully replacing them once we reach chapter 26. The book ends basically on a cliffhanger. Will the new generation be faithful and receive the promised land? Or will they fail like their parents did? Now you may remember that the big bulk of the book of Numbers is not narrative, but laws and priestly things, etc. So how do these sections fit in the macro narrative of traveling to the promised land and one generation taking the place of the next? Chapter 1 began with the census of the first generation, and then chapters 2 to 4 are practical instructions for the journey ahead. The laws of chapters 5 and 6 deal with what could be understood as a form of spiritual preparation for the journey, giving guidelines for things like a marriage troubled by suspicion and non-Levitical Israelites who want to make a special vow of dedication to God. Then chapters 7 through 10 verse 10 deal with mainly ritual ways in which the people were to prepare for the trip, including the various feasts they had to celebrate. Then, when the spies give their bad news and everything goes downhill, it is followed by a chapter on various sacrifices. Now remember from the video about Leviticus, the main purpose of sacrifices is the restoration and confirmation of the covenant and the covenant community. I don't think it is an accident that right after this massive breach of faith, there is an emphasis on the rituals that restore the community and the covenant. Then there is a second cycle of rebellion, this time the rebellion of Korah, who wants everyone to have the opportunity to become a priest. In response, he and his co-conspirators are killed during an earthquake. This is then followed by a miracle, where the staff of Aaron, the high priest, blossoms to confirm that he is God's chosen priest. And then the next 2 chapters detail the tasks of the Levites and the priests, and give some additional laws about purity, that is, on who can and cannot come close to God. This is once again part of an effort to restore the covenant relationship between God and his people. Then, after the new generation is properly introduced, the focus shifts to preparation for entering the land of Canaan. First a ritual preparation, then a spiritual preparation, and finally a practical preparation. I admit that this is a bit of an oversimplification, and I did put everything in a structure that is perhaps a bit too neat compared to how messy the text really is. So take all of this with a grain of salt. If you think that a particular paragraph or chapter doesn't follow my neat little structure, that is fine. This is only meant as an initial framework that may help you understand where in the book you are and what is going on in the surrounding chapters. Now, as for the meaning of this book, one thing that stands out in this book is of course the 40 years of wandering as a punishment because Israel didn't trust God. Now, this doesn't mean that every individual Israelite of the first generation was evil, nor that they weren't forgiven on a personal level for their lapse of faith, but the consequences for their actions came nonetheless. 2. Every generation has to make its own choice. This could be the central theme of the book, namely that the second generation has a choice to make. Yes, we should honor our father and our mother, but if they made wrong choices, we are neither obliged nor doomed to follow them. God has made a covenant with the people of Israel for all generations. But if that covenant is broken in one generation, there is always the hope that the next generation will do better. And finally, God doesn't quit. If this book wants to communicate one thing about the God of Israel, it is that he doesn't quit. For him the covenant stands and is open for renewal at any time. No matter how often or how badly Israel breaks the terms of the covenant, God is waiting and looking for opportunities to reaffirm and re-establish the covenant. Even if he inflicts heavy punishment on his people, they will always be his people. So that was Numbers. If you want more videos like this, like the video, tell me in the comments, and subscribe to this channel. You can also follow me on social media to stay up to date with news and announcements. My next Bible video will take on the last book of the Pentateuch, namely Deuteronomy. But next week we will first return to Hebrew and start talking about the new topic, nouns.